Today's LiveOnWeb episode, Managing Risk in Trucking, is sponsored by Protective Insurance.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Transport Topics Live on Web. I'm Joe Howard, Executive Editor of TT, and your host for this episode, which is titled Managing Risk in Trucking. There's a lot cooked into that title, including regulatory compliance, driver training, onboard safety equipment, insurance costs, and more. On the regulatory front, things are in a state of flux, as the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is in the midst of a review of its Compliance Safety Accountability Program, which applies scores to motor carriers and drivers' safety records. The scoring system that underpins the entire program is at the center of this review, and the outcome could affect how risk is managed in trucking for years to come, from both the compliance and business sides of the equation. We've got a panel of experts for today's show who can provide a boots-on-the-ground perspective on both sides of that equation. That starts with Joe DiLorenzo, Director of the Office of Enforcement and Compliance at FMCSA, someone with a front-row seat to the ongoing CSA review and all that has brought us to this point. For the fleet perspective, we welcome Lisa Gonnerman, Vice President of Safety and Security for Transport America, someone living day-to-day with how CSA scores affect a carrier. Keeping TT readers informed on all of this is Eric Miller, our Senior Regulatory Reporter and someone who we rely on here in the office for expertise on these issues. Later on, we'll hear from another TT staffer, Features Editor Fran Matzo-Lisak. She spoke via Skype with Bert Mayo, Director of Transportation Risk Solutions with True North Companies, about how CSA is affecting the insurance marketplace and what fleets can do to help themselves find the right coverage. Our program today is brought to you by Protective Insurance, and we thank them. You can participate in this discussion by emailing us at share@ttnews.com. We will do our very best to include your questions and your comments. Thank you all for being here today. Joe, we're going to start with you, since it's your agency that's giving us our news hook for this show. For viewers who may not know, could you just give us a brief history lesson on CSA and bring us up to date on why the system is under review and how we got to where we are today?
Sure, Joe, and thanks for having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to come and see you and talk to your audience. Not going back too far, but if we go back to 2010 and look at where we were, prior to 2010, we did have a system where the agency used the data that was available to identify which carriers to go and spend our investigative resources to try and improve safety. I mention that simply because that's really what this is all about. I think everybody probably understands the scope of the industry. There's over 500,000 motor carriers out there. We're lucky if we can get to about 2% of those motor carriers every year. So we're looking to try and get at, I say, the worst 2% of those carriers. So back in 2010, we decided we needed to relook at how we prioritize motor carriers and how we went after that improvement in safety. So leading up to there, we did a lot of testing. We did some public listening sessions, and in 2010, we went and we launched the CSA program, and specifically the safety measurement system, which is the data and the system that we're really talking about here. Since 2010, we've tried to be as responsive as we could. The data was available publicly in a different way, although it was available also before. And we did make some changes in response to some industry concerns and work through some of the issues and concerns that folks had, which led us up to maybe the more current history, which is recently, as part of our transportation reauthorization, we got some direction from Congress about how to move forward with CSA and with SMS in particular. What that legislation said was that certain elements of the CSA program that were publicly displayed earlier, namely the percentiles, which I know you and all of your viewers are very familiar with, as well as my panelists here, were not to be displayed for the property carriers subsequent to the review that you mentioned in your opening remarks. So since then, what's happened is, based on the legislation, the agency had contracted with the National Academies of Sciences to look at the system and provide us with some recommendations. So they did that. The report is publicly available. And what we're doing with it right now is we're taking those recommendations and we're working through the process of figuring out how we can implement them to help improve the system.
Okay, and so that's been going on for how long now, the review?
So the review the whole process started back in late 2015 and early 2016.
Okay.
The process of the National Academies doing the review, they provided us their report. So basically, since earlier this year in 2018, we've been working on the implementation process of those recommendations that they provided for us.
Okay.
Joe, I know you've had a public session in August and you've been hearing comments from the industry. What are some of the concerns and fears you're hearing from the industry, and how are you responding to kind of calm the anxiety?
Sure, it's a good question. And we had two public meetings. We had one back last year as we were developing what we would actually do in response to the recommendations. And this most recent meeting was about kind of some of the specifics of that. And I think the concern that I hear the most is, and I think this is all of our tendency, it's kind of like, how is my issue going to be dealt with? So we all know some of the concerns that folks have raised. And a lot of what we're hearing is, okay, so that's great. You talked to us about this IRT model, which I know we're going to talk about in a little bit. So what does that mean for me? So I think really it's just that level of uncertainty. And my response to that generally is, yes, I understand that, but what I'm really asking for is some patience, right? And I ask for two things, because it is a process. The National Academies asked us to look at this in a very different way than we've done before. So I think we all need to be a little bit patient with us. They specifically gave us a couple years because they knew it was going to be complicated. But it's almost not what I say to help, ease those fears, but it's kind of my ask of everybody is, put away your preconceived notions. Right, and what the National Academy said to us was, you're doing a pretty good job, but what you need is good kind of statistical basis for what you're doing. And part of that means all of us, myself included, has to put away a little bit of our expert judgment about what decisions we make about SMS and about other things, and at least start by letting the data drive the process. So. And I guess the last piece of it is, I always like to remind people that we said this very early on in the process, which is we are going to continue this conversation as we go forward. So we're going to have more opportunities once we really have some changes to make and some questions to ask to get the industry's input and others in order to really understand, what the best decisions to make are.
Mm-hmm. Are you far enough along yet on the research and testing to get a feel for if this is going to be a big improvement to CSA?
So I don't know if I can go quite that far, but what I can, where we are right now is really trying to understand the new process that the National Academies has outlined for us, and we're working with them on the implementation part of that. And I think what we really are starting to understand now is that, there are some basic things that we need to do. I think that while it's important for calculations in math and modeling to make things simple, that simplicity also is important for everybody to be able to understand, what we're doing. So I think at the very least, we can, we're at the point now where we can say, all right, we're starting to understand this model. We think we know what it's going to tell us. And I think the other message, for you and for the viewers is that the tool is not an answer. When we implement, or if we implement, however we end up going forward with SMS, what IRT will do at the very least is it provides us with information based on data to make decisions. Mm-hmm. That's why I say this conversation is still going to be an ongoing conversation, because the data is going to tell us a bunch of things, and we're going to have to go back and look at those data points and say, okay, now what does that mean for us in SMS? What does that mean for us for prioritizing carriers? And what does it mean for us in terms of how we make the data available public?
I had a discussion with Steve Bryan of Vigilo about the new IRT model, and he's a big supporter. He says it's going to be reflective more of a safety culture that a carrier has, and he's been already modeling the program with with some assumptions, and is a big supporter. He says it's going to increase the number of carriers that get on the radar. It's going to be more transparent. So I just wanted to add that comment that he's a big supporter of it.
Sure, and I think to your point, one thing that will be very helpful is I think that one of the good outcomes of this is something that we've all struggled with in terms of where do you draw the line? And we've always had to make a line, whether it's a line for a percentile or whether it's a line for how many inspections that we use. And one of the things that IRT allows us to do that we're starting to see is it may make those lines not as important because we'll be able to understand the confidence that we have in the data. So how do you compare two carriers with 4 bad inspections, one who had 4 of 5 versus one who had 4 of 20, which is something that we're really not great at doing in the current system. And confidence in that will be a really important piece for us in terms of how to go forward in our mission to prioritize these carriers.
So Lisa, I'd like to hear your perspective on this. Not only, I'd like to hear what you think of, what you know so far of the IRT model, but I'd like to maybe hear your perspective, kind of take the same tack that Joe took, sort of a history lesson of what you've experienced with CSA thus far and how you see what changes you might like to see and how you think and hope that the system might improve with the changes that we're anticipating.
Sure. When CSA first came out, it was a learning curve for everyone to understand the program. And honestly, I think CSA has done some really good things to the industry. It has really brought safety to the forefront, which is a very good thing. And I think that needs to continue, and that's the piece that I like about it the most. So I think there are a lot of uses right now of the program, and even today with those public scores being are taken away from the public, it's still being used every day. We get customers from bids that we have to provide that information for. So I think some of the concerns with the program that we have in the industry is we want it to be fair, we want it to be consistent, and really truly reflect the safety of our programs in our company. And there's a few disparities in there that we do have some concerns with. There are different geographic regions. You could have a fleet that works in a very rural area, hardly ever sees a scale or an inspector, and they have very few inspections. You could have another fleet that's in a very metropolitan urban area and along the interstate, a lot of inspections. Is that really one fleet better than the other because of that? So I think that's one thing. You also have some geographic differences from state by state as far as the enforcement efforts. So we all use, I think, Texas, sorry to pick on Texas, but they have a higher number of vehicle maintenance. So if you have a lot of trucks in that area, your vehicle maintenance is probably going to be higher. They just tend to see more there. Another piece is the crash and the preventability. And again, I have concerns with our motoring public out there today that is much more aggressive and distracted. And it's not always the truck driver's fault, but we take a lot of those accidents on our profiles, even when we may know that it's not our fault. So, and that gets used against us. So I think what we're looking for is just a really a fair system that will evaluate our safety and our culture. The IRT model sounds very promising. I'm very happy to hear of Steve's, Brian's feedback. And it gives me a lot of hope that there is a model out there. This is a model that hasn't been used in transportation before. It's been used quite a bit in the healthcare industry and for standardized testing. So I'm hopeful that this will give us kind of that ground base to reformulate the program and have it a fair, effective program for the industry, because it is used in a lot of different ways even today. And some of it, I would say, may not always reflect really the true safety culture of that carrier today. So that's my concern.
That's a good answer. Yeah, Joe, I wonder if you are far enough along that you could provide maybe an example or two of how violation weights might change. I recall at a recent conference you were talking about the speeding violations, and you came up with a few surprises on that when you ran a test of it.
Sure, that actually probably is the best example, and this is where the whole put your preconceived notions away is important, because we in the model, the current SMS, when we look at the different speeding violations, there's 3 different speeding violations: 6 to 10, 11, 14, 15, and up. And as experts, we say speeding is bad, and the faster you go, the worse it is. So we have them ordered that way in terms of how the violations are weighted. When the National Academies, they ran a little bit of just a small test on some of the data in this process. And when they did it and they looked at kind of how those violations relate to crashes, the order actually almost reversed. So, 6 to 10 actually showed stronger relationship to crashes. And so people like us, we all sit around, so we like, why is this? And one of the things, the IRT has another name in the kind of the academic world. It's called latent trait theory. And what that means is that the IRT model is seeing some things in that data that we as experts can't really see. Maybe it's the fact, and this is just kind of our like brainstorming, like maybe it's the fact that 6 to 10s happen more often in urban areas because, anybody that lives around here knows it's pretty hard on most days to get above 10 miles an hour over the speed limit on the Washington Beltway. But you're maybe going 6 or 7 or 8 over in really bad traffic conditions. So it's seeing some of the other elements that maybe we as experts can't see when we're just looking at a speeding violation and its relationship to crashes. So that was one that even, I've been doing this a long time, and a bunch of us sat around and said, hey, this doesn't seem right. Why is this? And trusting the data and looking at it and understanding that IRT is able to see some pieces of what's going on behind the scenes maybe that we can't see just through our own judgment.
Yeah, I know you're possibly going to conduct a test early next year. I wonder what's the next step in this process, and when do you have a target date for implementation?
Sure. Were you going to add something to that first?
I was just going to ask another
That's
question,
fine.
actually.
Then I will not answer your question, but before we moved on.
So, Joe, one of the challenges I think the industry has too is, there's a lot of trucking companies out there, a lot of various sizes, and a lot of very small trucking companies. I think 90% of the trucking companies are less than 6 trucks, and about 70% of those don't have a CSA score. Is there a means that more carriers would be involved in the CSA and have a score of some sort?
I do think that's a possibility. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is where confidence in the data comes in. Because right now we have these data sufficiency thresholds that, either 3 or 5, that if you don't have that many bad inspections, you're just not on the radar. And I think that if we're able to, kind of mature the model to the point where we're getting confidence in the data for the smaller carriers, I think that will help, because that will help us to see, kind of to your example, we talk about this all the time, my example of 4 bad inspections, we just looked at a carrier like this, 4 really bad inspections, it's not 5, but the question then is, should we be waiting for 5? And that's what, we as, in our prioritization struggle with. So I do feel like we will get to the point where we'll be able to maybe understand a better piece of the industry. The other thing that we look at, though, is that, what we are getting of the carriers with percentiles, most of the crash experience is with those carriers, mainly because of exposure, but also, to the main point of why we do this is to not get to the issue of crash experience, so get to some of those folks before they do. So.
And another piece I think that we see is, there's a lot of crashes out there. So the data piece, so you have your inspection piece, and then you have the other side is the data coming from the carriers. Can you talk about any of the changes that you're looking at for that to get more of the crashes, more of the miles from all the carriers? Because I think the IRT model has a lot of potential, but I think we all know the data coming in has to be accurate as well to make that model work the best.
This will teach me to let you ask questions in the middle of the whole thing.
I'm sorry.
So, yeah, I should know better.
It makes the show better, Joe. It's okay.
Well, that's why I'm here, right? So You know, the data quality, when the National Academies gave the recommendations, they really put them in two categories. One is the data and the data quality, and the other one is, this whole IRT modeling thing. So to your point about the data, that is definitely a challenge that we're working on in kind of parallel to this work we're doing in IRT. We are somewhat limited and always will be in the data that we have and the quality of that data. It is self-reported data. And you mentioned miles, so I'll use that as the example because that also came up in the National Academy's report. Baseline denominator mileage data is difficult. We have a self-reported requirement that should get updated every 2 years. One of the things we're doing in that area is we are looking at other sources of data to see if it could help us either validate those miles or otherwise. So things like IRP and IFTA data to see if there are other data sources out there. We're always going to be limited at what we can collect as the government and the ability to do that. The carriers that are active, like you all, I know you're in there all the time updating your power unit data and your mileage data, and that's great, but not necessarily everyone is doing that. So we are looking at some other ways where we can maybe get some checks against that mileage data. We have some built into the system, but it's really hard to tell from our perspective. So maybe some of these other sources of data that are out there will help us to kind of validate those numbers and maybe make some improvements on that end.
Okay, thank you. We're looking forward to that.
Sure.
Yeah, and I wondered your next move. You're going to do a testing earlier, I guess, next year?
Sure. We've actually done some small scale kind of exploratory testing already, again, to kind of see how it works with the data. One of the things we're finding is it is complicated and it could take a really long time to run. So we've done some tests with a randomly selected group of 10,000 carriers to look at the violations and kind of see how that all worked out. So we're going to continue working through that process. Something else that has to happen is the item in item response theory, we need to consider what that means. And towards your question about how do we improve mileage data, items in the way we're looking at it right now are violations. And there's 899 violations that we use in SMS. And that is a massive number of violations. And so part of what we're going to do before we go too much further with the exploratory testing and the small scale models is how do we reduce that number of items? Some of you probably remember we used to use just out of service violations in our prioritization, and then we went to all violations. And maybe the right answer is somewhere in between. And so we're working on some violation cleanup and maybe consolidation of that, which will also help with the simplicity and understandability factor. And we're going to have some continuing technical discussions with the National Academies so that we can get to a point where we can run something and run a model hopefully early in the year next year that will be helpful to talk about. Right now it's a lot of kind of numbers and analysis, but we really want to get something together so that we can get the industry together and say, okay, here's kind of where we are. We need to check in. How do you feel about this? Are there other things we should be considering and the like? So those are really the next steps.
And you have an implementation date in mind, or?
Well, the National Academies gave us gave us the 2 years, which would be towards the end of the year next year. A lot just depends on what the results are. Again, I'm a good, government employee. I've got deadlines. I've got things I want to do. And we're trying to kind of put those aside a little bit and say, hey, let's see what the data says. Let's see what the conversation with the industry is. And there's going to be decisions to make. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that IRT is not an answer. It's going to provide us some data to make some decisions. So if we can make decisions that will help in terms of the SMS goal of targeting carriers as well as addressing industry concerns, I think that's what we're working towards. So,
is it possible that this whole new concept gets dumped in the end?
Anything is possible. So, what the National Academy, I don't think it's likely. Okay. Hope that's not the thing everybody gets mad at me for saying. Okay. But, the National Academy specifically said in the recommendation, they said, if it performs better, then move forward with implementation. So I don't want to, a lot of different things can happen between now and then, and I think the most important thing is that we're having this conversation, and as we go forward, we continue to have that conversation as we make those decisions about, going forward. I keep saying that the very worst possible thing that could come out of this is we've learned a lot about the data and what the data means, and that in itself, I think, will influence some of the decisions that we make going forward.
That's great.
Well, I know from an industry perspective, we do appreciate the partnership and the feedback that you're requesting, and working together to improve the program. And we've seen different pieces of that throughout the program. So this is kind of that next step, and we're hopeful from what you've said and what Steve said about where it's going. So we're looking forward to the next step.
Great.
As a reminder, you're watching LiveOnWeb's Managing Risk in Trucking. As we continue, we invite you to participate in the show. You can email questions or comments to share@ttnews.com, and we'll do our best to address them during the show. So it's not just Lisa who can pick on Joe, you can too. So, But, a big part of this managing risk is, the driver part of this, because they're the ones who are out there, they're the ones who are affecting these scores as much as anybody, but as much as other drivers on the road, as you mentioned.
Right.
So there's a lot cooked into getting the right people, in those trucks. Can you talk about what your screening process has been like, in a CSA world? What are you looking for when new candidates come in the door, and maybe a training regimen and coaching as they go along?
We're looking at all the data that we can to look at that background of a driver. And it's a tough market right now, but it doesn't mean you can't take your eye off of the data and what kind of driver you're pulling into your company. So we're looking at their violation history, their accident history, the criminals, the full application, the background, who have they worked for, what's their history there. We're looking at all those different pieces of it, as well as the drug and alcohol. We go an extra step with the hair testing, those types of things, to make sure that we still have a safe driver out there. And it is tough. I know we've talked about the shortage for a long time, but I think it's here, and we're in the middle of it, and I don't see a whole lot of relief coming anytime soon. So that's the challenge. So I know as a company, we're looking at standards as far as what do you do, but we also have to remember that, and the bottom line comes, we have to hire that driver that is still going to be safe out there. And honestly, we're putting more time into training and the focus on training when we're getting drivers in the door as well.
Can you go into details about that training regimen? I mean, is there a certain
Yeah,
time?
we're looking at that background when we bring somebody on. If there's a history, maybe that they don't have a vehicle inspection, for example, they have some violations there. We'll try to look at where they came from, what's the history, and provide some targeted training up front along with a full orientation.
Sure.
So our orientation program, we're really not looking to cut it down. We're looking to try to, how do you get your point across and make it more effective overall. So that orientation is very important, along with the continued training as the drivers are over the road. We have simulators, so we're using simulators to try to increase those skills, because there are some, I think it's harder to get an experienced driver these days too, so it's less experienced, and not everybody has a whole history. So how do you provide that? We also have trainers that the drivers go out with, and there's a lot of documentation and skills testing that they have to pass before they're approved to go on to the solo world by themselves. So a lot of different things. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of paperwork and documentation to make sure that you have all that in place, and continued training. At this point, you can't train enough right now, in my opinion. And you got to make it effective training. You can't just put a driver in front of a DVD and expect them to get everything out of it. So how do you get them engaged in the training, I think, is a key piece, and make them feel like they own it, and how does it affect them and their families? That's the important piece.
In terms of incentivizing drivers, for good performance, I guess there's coaching if there's a problem, but then also rewarding good behavior as well.
That's correct. So we can't always beat them up. We have to incentivize them and make sure that we're putting some things out there that incent them to do the right thing. So there's different bonus programs, safety bonuses, little things like hats and fun little letters or something that goes out to the family go a long way. That recognition from their leader, from the safety leader, the president of the company, anything like that goes a long way. It doesn't have to always spend a lot of money to get that, but it's important that you do have those positive programs in place for your drivers.
Yeah, and I'm hearing from some of the fleets, Lisa, that they're having to take on more risk with their hiring of drivers as a result of the shortage. I'm wondering if that's a potential problem in the industry or a challenge.
Yeah, I think it is a challenge, and I think it is something that the industry is facing because the amount of drivers out there that are well-skilled and have that wonderful history that we'd love to have every driver to have from a performance standpoint, they're fewer and further between, which makes it harder. And so, yeah, there are some tough decisions that companies do have to make as far as where are they willing to take some risk and what can they do to alleviate that, maybe once they get that person in the door through, for example, the training piece that I mentioned, or a training program with going out with a trainer, something like that. So there are decisions that have to be made, but in the long run, you know, we're responsible because they're out there with the inspectors and they're driving our scores and what we do, which impacts the risk, which impacts what our customers, brokers, everybody looks at. So it's some tough decisions.
So I know one of the things that you guys use in particular is video monitoring as another way to manage that risk and manage,
We do.
you know, the things that can happen on the road that can affect your safety scores and your bottom line. And
Certainly.
I mean, a lot more than just, you know, just it's life and death sometimes. So talk about how, you know, that video data informs and can protect the drivers.
It really can. We do have a fleet that is fully with video technology, and I don't know if I'd have a fleet without one anymore today.
Yeah.
And I know more and more fleets are going to that, and it can be very beneficial. And even with our motoring public that we talked about out there, more aggressive, more distracted, it always goes to, you know, that driver makes a phone call into risk, they report their accident, and, you know, we have that tendency to think right away of what did the driver do, but it's not always the case, and the video can prove it. Just in the last 8 weeks, we've had several exoneration videos that really have shown our driver did everything they could, and we were still hit by the number 2 vehicle. And with that video, we have that proof. And if we didn't have that video, the amount of reserves that we would have put on those claims would have been substantially more than we did because we had the video that can help protect ourselves. So it does make a big difference. We can coach a lot of different things with the video, whether it's internal or external. You can get a lot of benefit out of it, coaching behaviors, and we all have behaviors. And once we get the videos, we can monitor those behaviors, we can coach it, and it's very beneficial for the driver to see that video. You can explain it to them, but once they see kind of that game film of what actually happens, it's hard to argue. And it's that reality of what they're doing that helps them adjust their behavior. So as you then see changes in that behavior, that's where it's important to have your positive enforcement programs in place too.
That's a great point, because I was going to ask you what kind of reaction the drivers have. Are they resistant to the video? Are they receptive? I guess depends on the situation.
You know, I think it depends on the driver too,
Yeah.
but we actually have requests from drivers, some of our fleet that maybe one isn't working, that they want to go get their own because they feel they want that protection and they need that protection. So I've had that in several different companies where we found out, you know, we didn't have it and the driver got their own. So I think there is more adaptation to it, more willingness to have the video, and they understand how it can actually help them too. And one of the things we try to do is take those exoneration videos and show them to our fleets too, and also use it in some training that we put together so they can see how we use the video to help them be better and more successful at our company. And we do have a incentive program put together to reward that behavior as it changes to make it better as well.
Joe, how does that affect your relationship with fleets? I mean, a lot of fleets now have this hard evidence that they're bringing to the table when it comes to some of the violations.
Sure. I mean, from our perspective, I mean, obviously we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but there's been obviously this huge growth in the use of video. And it is helpful when we have discussions about crashes with carriers over preventability or not, that the video can really take the place of almost everything else in order to kind of help. And so we have seen it in our, albeit limited, crash review program, where carriers are submitting crashes for preventability, that when they submit video, it makes the decisions really easy because, as you said, it's all kind of right there in front of you.
It is.
And it makes it. I think we've even seen in that program just what you're describing, a comfort level where there's kind of a resistance to it, to fleets finding that there's all sorts of uses for it. Probably one of the least of which is, how they deal with us on their crash history.
Yeah, it's that's one of the first things we ask for when an accident's called in was our video, because we know exactly where we're at then and what really happened. Not saying that we don't always get the truth, but you do get different perspectives and how things could be reported. So we know exactly what's going on. It's very beneficial.
Yes,
Yeah.
and video is without bias.
Right. Can't argue with it.
A driver went through a traumatic experience, no matter what happened,
Right.
and that always can be confusing. And
Right.
even to the point where sometimes I think drivers are, and some of the things that we see are kind of more concerned about what they did.
Right.
And the video actually clearly shows. Because
yeah.
they're so self-conscious and so conscientious about what they're doing.
Exactly.
You might get a little bit of a different version of the story.
You may.
And plus, and you're relying on something that can be reviewed over and over and over again versus relying on a memory that's going to fade over time. That the drivers are looking to get away from the problem. So if the video captures the problem when the driver was necessarily looking away from, say, a car coming over to try to get away, that's where you want to have something that is unbiased. And
It is, and things happen very fast. You
Yeah.
think about going down the interstate at 62, 65 miles an hour, and somebody comes into the side of your truck. It happens very quickly, and so to have that video is really explains the story a lot.
as a reminder, one more time, you're watching LiveOnWeb's look at managing risk in trucking. As we continue on, we invite you to participate. You can shoot us an email at share@ttnews.com, and we'll do our best to get your comments in during this program. I did want to turn to equipment, not video equipment, but actually the onboard safety equipment. Where there's so much on a truck now to mitigate risk, to help the driver avoid it in the first place. So can you talk about some of the collision avoidance technologies that that your fleet uses and that you have found beneficial? And Joe, I want to hear your perspective on that as well.
At Transport America, we really do equip our trucks with really the most technology. There's no substitute for a skilled, qualified, safe driver, obviously, but the technology can assist them. Like we talked about, things happen so fast. And so the collision avoidance systems all of our trucks have that unit. It's very beneficial. Highly encourage fleets to take a look at that because it is a very good thing. Lane departure, roll stability. We have some side detection monitoring coming on some of the trucks where on the side, so lane changes can always be a challenge, and to make sure that there's even more awareness from that standpoint. So all of those different pieces, you always do an ROI when you put the new technology on the truck, and we've seen a very quick turnaround in the collision mitigation systems, that it can really help. And those rear end accidents in particular is a big difference. Rear end is typically a DOT accident where there's an injury, there's a tow, could be pretty serious depending on the rate of speed. And those are cut in half, almost eliminated with those systems that are working in the manner. So I think the systems have done a really good job to really enhance the product out there. So there's some really good products that do a great job to assist that driver to be safe and keep the motoring public safe.
What has FMCSA found about all this, Joe?
I think the points made here were very good. I think we can offer maybe just a little bit of context on that. From a technology standpoint, we're obviously supportive of, but not prescriptive, about the technologies. Carriers need to identify the technologies that work best for them. What we see that we like to remind folks of as we look across carriers is technology is not actually a solution. It's part of a solution, and it has to be part of your overall safety management program. If you decide that what's important to your fleet because you're having tire issues is that you're going to use a tire pressure monitoring system, that's excellent. However, that requires a system of review of the alerts that you're getting,
that's a great point.
and what actions will be taken in response to those. And I think sometimes we're all quick to, in trucking as well as in the rest of our lives, to find a technology that will help us, accomplish some task. And so we just like to make sure that folks are kind of, using it as part of their system. Even things like, adaptive cruise or the collision warning systems, as a carrier, it's great because it may have prevented that action, but you're getting all of this data, and how are you using it to inform not just that driver, but the rest of your. Sometimes I've seen some fleets who have gotten some great data by looking at locations, and we're getting all kinds of alerts in this particular stretch of road. So, hey, driver Eric, remember when you get there, keep your speeds down, those kinds of things. So we're just looking for it in terms of, managing it as part of your overall system and all your overall safety management controls that you're putting in place.
Yeah, that's a great point, because you have the data. It's the behavior. How do you change the behavior is really what those systems can do for you that you have to use.
Now, Lisa, I also wanted to ask, do insurers offer any kind of incentives for having the various equipment on the trucks?
I have heard that some of the insurance carriers do, some don't, but it's definitely one of the things that they're asking about.
Okay.
As far as what technology is on the fleets and what's your percentage of being equipped with all the different technologies, because I think the underwriters are very, very interested in the technology as an assistance to be safe. And I think it also goes to the safety culture of a company of, it's not cheap, some of those systems. It's an investment that you have to make, but obviously safety is worth it. So how serious is that company from a safety investment standpoint in their culture? But yes, it's definitely a question that is important to them.
And speaking of insurance, I did want to get to, at this point, our interview with Bert Mayo from True North Companies. Our own features editor, friend Matt Zolizak, spoke to Bert about the insurance marketplace and the treacherous waters sometimes that fleets must navigate when they're trying to find the best coverage. So we'll turn to that, the first of two parts, right here, right now. So thank you for watching, and check it out.
How do insurance companies currently use CSA scores to evaluate a motor carrier's risk?
Well, most insurance companies take the CSA basic scores and use them as a initial indicator of that risk to determine, the value they're going to place on the insurance program. It was 18 months ago, insurance companies would look at motor carriers with 2 or 3 basics and alerts, and as long as the loss experience was good and they had good controls in place, we could place that risk, with one of the primary markets. Today, motor carriers with 3 alerts and average loss experience, we're going to have a very difficult time finding insurance.
What have been some key concerns from motor carriers over the past year or two when it comes to the CSA basic alerts?
Well, for the motor carrier, I refer to me as part of the industry, the motor carrier industry. We haven't seen it as equitable or fair across the board. You've got state and local biases, meaning that certain states, there's a top 10 list out there, but states like New York, Georgia, Florida, state of Texas, Idaho, not picking on those states, there's a top 10 list. Those states write more violations per inspection than the rest of the country. So if you operate in any of those states, you wind up with a higher score. So that has nothing to do with your operation. It has everything to do with the state and how that state enforces the rules or the law. So that's one issue. Second, another big issue is peer grouping. So we call them safety event groups within CSA, and meaning motor carriers of like size. Well, in this case, it's like number of inspections. And that is irregardless of the type of operation you are. So it's a bias based off of your, again, the state and the type of operation you are. It's not really equitable that a flatbed carrier is compared to a tank operation, it's compared to a package delivery company, it's compared to a drive-in company. So it's not really the same peer group. One of the other big things that I see is the data queue process. The data queue process seems to be very lacking in how it's dealt with. You wind up in data queue, for those of you that don't know, it's the appeal process within CSA where you get a violation, you disagree, it's how you appeal that violation. That violation is typically reviewed by the officer that cited you. So it's sent back to the same officer. He or she is then asked to review their citation and make a decision to overturn it. And there's very little appeal to that. All you can do is continue to send it to that same officer. Occasionally, some states will allow a supervisor to look at it.
But just backing up a little bit, Bert, so with these basic alerts, that's making it even harder for them to get, or it's making premiums skyrocket. Could you just back up and elaborate on that point a little bit? What does it mean for motor carriers looking to buy commercial auto liability insurance?
Today, we've been going on for CSA for now nearly 8 years across the country. So now there's evidence, when you talk to the insurance market, there's evidence that having certain basics and alerts, you'll pay higher claims. So the ones I hear cited most often are going to be unsafe driving. If you're an alert there, you're an alert in hours of service, or you're an alert in vehicle maintenance. Typically, insurance companies pay higher claims for those basics being an alert.
Fran Matzo-Lisak and Bert Mayo talking about the market for insurance for trucking companies and how difficult it can be, and he talks about it being a hard market. So he mentions that CSA scores are an initial indicator for risk. So can you talk a little bit about, Lisa, what you see in the marketplace and how tough it is and how true that is?
It is a tough market in the insurance world. We've had some changes as far as the carriers out there, which has made it a little bit tighter, more competitive. So it is a challenge, and they do use the CSA scores as kind of an indicator of what's going on. And I think it's always important to meet with the carriers, the underwriters, and really have them understand your program, what your safety program is, what the technology is that you use, because there is more than the CSA scores that go into a safety program. It is how you manage them, what are your drivers, your safety management programs, your training, all of those different pieces out there. I think it's very important to have them understand the full picture. But it is a tough market right now. And with the lawsuits and the high dollar of the lawsuits and some of the recent ones, I think that will continue to be a challenge, unfortunately.
Okay. We did get a reader question. I wanted to get it in. So from Travis Bush, he's asking, what are your thoughts on lowering the driving age for over the road? So it's 21 now. There's a lot of talk about that. It's in Congress about bringing that down to let 18, 19, 20-year-olds go over the road.
I'll jump in. We have had conversations on that, and I know that some carriers have had the discussions as well. Some have using them on the intrastate side before this, so not something new to them. But I think the bigger challenge is how do we get drivers into the industry? I know in our discussions we looked at, and I have a young son that's in his 20s, and I've looked at him and his friends, and would I want to hand the keys over? Some are yes, some are no, even today at 23. But so I think it goes into what it is that you're looking at, and what are the programs that you're putting in place to ensure that you have a responsible person at that age, which can be tough, but I think that's an important piece. And I think one other piece is, as we've had discussions, it's important to involve your insurance carrier. Your main insurance carrier, as far as what are their reactions, are they willing to insure that type of driver? And I know we've had some feedback from ours that they are not willing to insure down to 18. And so it's important to look at that whole picture before you make any decisions to go further. I always want to have more people come into the industry, and I think it's a challenge that we have to tackle as an industry yet.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the severity, the differences in, say, violations. Indiana is notorious, for example, for speeding. Is there going to be some leveling of the playing field with the IRT model on this?
Sure, I think there's a couple things that have come up, and in the video, the issue of differences between states came up, and here, and kind of the differences of violations. And the new modeling techniques with IRT certainly have the capability to address those issues. I think, towards the idea of severity weights, I'm not even sure we're going to have severity weights. It may be that we don't need them anymore because of how we structure the violations. So it may be that we find a different way to adjust them, or maybe some way to make them less granular, as opposed to the kind of the 1 through 10 scale that we have now. So I think all of those kinds of things, and I feel a little bit like I'm just trying to avoid answering the question and just saying, sure, the IRT will fix that. But I think to
That's
some
what we
extent,
want to hear.
I know it is. Well, that's why I'm saying it, because but I think part of it is we need to see. But those types of things, for those of you that look at legislation and read what we were told to look at, there was a laundry list of very specific items that were directed to the national academies to review, very specific things like violation severity weights and other things along those lines. And in the National Academies report, they reference all of those things, but they reference them in the context of letting the IRT model help you to address all of these issues. So kind of towards my earlier, let's sort of put what we think of now in terms of the structure of SMS may not be the same as what we end up with IRT. So, but there certainly, I think, is really strong, data there that the IRT will be able to give us towards our example you and I discussed earlier on the speeding. That was a violation severity example. Which one should we place more weight on in terms of evaluating different violations? So remains to be seen a little bit.
We got a good viewer comment from Gary at New Century Transport, who makes the point, and I guess asks the question: all carriers should be prioritized. All new carriers should be prioritized for inspections until such time as we have enough inspections on them that we can be somewhat assured they know what they're doing. We should not give them the benefit of the doubt and assume they are good until proven bad. They should earn their CSA score by going through clean inspections. How about that, prioritizing the newbies?
Sure, that's a good question. Now, so there is a program for new carriers that is separate but related to kind of what we're talking about here in terms of prioritization. Every new carrier that comes in is what we consider a new entrant. And those new entrant carriers are subject to, first of all, an audit within the first 12 months that they're on there. So somebody will be reviewing their records and their safety management controls in that first year, which I think is important towards the point that, in some cases, new carriers really are new carriers and they're gaining a lot of experience and maybe more susceptible to some safety problems at that point in time. So we have that program that's in there. While that goes on, we do continue to evaluate their CSA score. So there definitely is a recognition on our part that the new carriers that come into the industry do require a little bit of extra scrutiny. In terms of size and scope, and this sometimes is amazing to people, but there are about 40,000 or so new carriers every year that enter the industry. Our total number of carriers does not change by 40,000 every year, so it's almost a turnover of 40,000 carriers a year. So it definitely is something that we watch through the new entrant program, but always are looking for ways to kind of streamline that because the scope of that is so large.
Okay. Let's throw it real quick to the second part of Fran's interview with Burt Mayo. They're going to talk about some tips that fleets can use for finding the best insurance coverage.
What are some tips for motor carriers and fleets looking to lower their insurance premiums and related costs in light of everything that we just discussed, and until some certainty, however long this will take, in the revamp of the CSA program?
Well, just managing your overall cost, we call it cost of risk. So that's your premium dollar plus the money you spend on your accidents, crashes within the deductible, things you pay out of pocket. Just managing that overall cost with a better program, better processes, better controls, telematics, managing CSA. Those things will help you lower those costs. I would tell you today, though, in a hard market, we refer to a hard market. And what I mean by a hard market, that means insurance rates are going up. In a hard market, even doing those things, you're going to struggle to get lower insurance rates. So obviously, the next step in that is to take on more risk, meaning you're going to own more of that claim. You're going to have higher deductibles or higher retention. And just by the virtue of having higher retentions means you're going to pay more of that loss. So, again, you've got to get better at managing the claim, better at reducing that claim, be it telematics, better programs, better controls, better processes. There's captives out there. Captives can get you into a place with lower premiums, if you will. I just would caution anyone going into a captive to think long and hard about it, make sure it's calculated. Once you are in a captive, it's very difficult to get out of a captive because you've got a lot of collateral tied up. It's a long play. It's truly an extended play. Jumping out of a captive is not as easy as getting in one. The other thing captives have, if you're not careful, they have hidden management fees, hidden actuarial fees, and you got to remember it's a shared risk program, meaning you are in a program with other motor carriers, so if they have bad experience, that reflects on your pricing or your pocketbook also.
To elaborate a little bit more, like what size fleets are you seeing, small, medium, large? Who would that be the ideal to really get into a captive? And if you can briefly explain in very simple terms what a captive is?
Yeah, so a captive is, I would call it shared loss. So meaning if I have a trucking company, you have a trucking company, we find the typical marketplace out there is we can't afford the insurance rates. They're just too high. So me and you would get together and we would have leverage our economy of scale. We would bring more trucks or more risk to the marketplace, and then we would share in that risk. So we would combine our premium dollar. We would take a higher deductible. We would pay that deductible out of pocket or out of the premiums you would pay into that captive. In theory, at the end of that, if we've controlled our losses better, then we get a dividend paid back, meaning we pay more in premium than we pay out in dollars, so we get a dividend paid back to us. Occasionally, captives become kind of a catchy thing, kind of the new thing. It's just something to proceed with caution. It's not always the wrong move, but it's not always the right move.
Another broker that I've spoken to has said that they're seeing it, at least more of a trend, go that way in recent years, at least with this company. Is it a certain size of motor fleet is my question. Yeah.
Yeah, if I had to guess, I mean, it's not, where I see it makes sense, I'm not guessing, but where it makes sense, it's going to make sense for the motor carrier. It's in that 100, 200, 250 to 500. You get over 500, I believe, in my experience, you can manage your risk with a high deductible or what we call a high retention product, just meaning you'll take $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 of your risk. We can take that dollar, invest in your company, you become a more profitable, just a better overall, more efficient company, plus you're controlling your loss and you're able to buy insurance at a higher, a higher contact. So, I mean, you're buying in at $250,000 or $250,000, so you're not paying as much premium. You're reinvesting that dollar within the company. When you're over 500, truck 500 and above, you need to be in a high retention program and managing those costs under that high retention yourself. No one's going to spend your money like you are. So you can pass it off to a captive. Captives still have to have management teams, so you have to have a TPA to manage your claims. You have to have someone manage the money in the captive. Still, no one will ever manage your money like you will.
Great insight from Bert Mayo from True North Companies. Bert, thank you. And I did want to make the point that, because as you can see, Bert was in his car when he did that interview because his schedule turned upside down on that particular day, but he wanted to come through for us. But he didn't do it while he was driving. He pulled over and did the interview. So we had a challenge on that one, and we want to thank Bert for that. And Lisa turned her schedule around to accommodate us so she could be here live. So a lot of people have gone to great lengths for this show today. So we do hope you've enjoyed it. I think that Bert really kind of encapsulated all that we're trying to tackle and address here, because he said it. It's just managing your risk, and he made that excellent point. Nobody's going to spend your money better than you, but it all cooks in. Everything you can do to just manage that level of risk is what's going to protect your carrier in the long run.
Right.
So I want to thank Joe DiLorenzo, Lisa Gonerman, and Eric Miller for this great show today. If we learned anything, is that managing risk in trucking is complex and can get expensive. We've also learned that the CSA program plays a vital role in fleet's ability to manage that risk, so the outcome of this ongoing review matters a lot, Joe. No pressure. So kidding aside again, thank you to my panel for this great show today, and keep your eyes out for the next Live on Web, which will be coming up in December. We'll have more information later on in the weeks ahead. Thanks again to Fran Matzo-Lisak and also Bert Mayo, and we'll see you in December. Thanks a lot for watching.